Okay, continuing on to the next example, Genesis chapter 3 through chapter 4 keeps a steady chronological order up until we get to chapter 5. Now here in chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, we can see that this covers when Adam had Seth and when Seth had Enos. But if we look back to the end of chapter 4, we can see that verses 25 and 26 also cover when Adam had Seth and Seth had Enos. So we see an overlap here where the same information is presented twice. This is indicative that these are two different sections. The chronology breaks, and so we know it has to be two different sections because we're getting the same information twice. It cannot be keeping a steady chronological order because in chapter 5, when we get to verse 3, we see that Adam has Seth again when he's 130 years. So obviously this cannot be the same chronology as what we're reading in Genesis chapter 4 verse 25. So these are separate sections and we have a break in chronology. Now something should be noted. In Genesis chapter 4 verse 17 it says that Cain knew his wife. Yet prior to this there is no mention of Adam having daughters. And the first time when we see daughters mentioned is in chapter 5, verse 4, after Adam has had Seth, when he was 130 years old. So this is an apparent conflict, and many people have noted this conflict. And many people, including secular skeptics about the Bible, say, well, where did Cain's wife come from? And a very common answer from Christians is, well, Adam and Eve must have had a daughter and Cain's wife was his sister. And that makes the most sense. However, in reading Genesis in chronological order, we see these section breaks in a new section, and daughters are not mentioned until after Adam has had Seth, which was when Adam was 130. And so if we look at chapter 4, prior to verse 17, contextually there is a big question mark, a big blank there, a blank space that seems like it should be filled with mention of Adam and Eve having a daughter who became Cain's wife and who was also his sister. And so let's make note of that. Now if we continue on looking at chapter 5, going through verse 7 up through 32, this ends with Noah, who was 500 years old, having his 3 sons. And if we continue on into chapter 6, it seems, well, we've been going in chronological order through the rest of chapter 5 here. There's no overlap. We get to Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, and it reads, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them." So here's the question. When did men begin to multiply on the face of the earth and have daughters born unto them? Now, was it the first time that daughters are mentioned being born in Genesis 5 verse 4 when it says that Adam had daughters after he begat Seth, and we know that was when he was 130? No, because when we look up to the previous section of Genesis 4 and we can see verse 17 that Cain knew his wife, and this is all the same section through the end of chapter 4. And we can tell that because there's an overlap between Genesis 4 verses 25 and 26 and Genesis 5 verses 1 through 6. So chapter 4 is one section, and chapter 5 here has an overlap in verses 1 through 6. So what does that mean? That means that in Genesis 4 verse 25, when it talks about how Adam knew his wife again and she bare a son and called his name Seth, that it is referring here to the same event that's described in Genesis chapter 5 verse 3 that says that Adam lived 130 years and has a son named Seth after he was 130 years. So when did men begin to multiply and have daughters born unto them? We know that this had to have started with Cain's wife, who was his sister, somewhere in chapter 4, prior to verse 17. That is when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. So, did this begin at the first mention of Adam having daughters? No, it had to have begun prior to when Cain knew his wife. That is when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. But we can also see that after Cain knew his wife, that they conceived Enoch, and that Enoch had a son, and he had a son, and he had a son, and we end up with Lamech, and Lamech had 2 wives. And so by this time, every time that born or begat is mentioned, we know there was a woman involved. And so there obviously were daughters that had been born to someone for there to be begatting going on, and Lamech actually had 2 wives. So while we know that this had to have begun prior to verse 17 with Cain's wife, who was his sister, it was the first time men multiplied and had a daughter, that definitely by the time we get to verses 18 and 19 of chapter 4, there are daughters that have been born and men are multiplying. The marker that lets us know that daughters must have been born, at least one daughter must have been born, prior to verse 17 is that it says that Cain knew his wife. And so we can see that somewhere in chapter 4, prior to verse 17, Adam and Eve must have had a daughter for Cain to marry his sister and have a wife. Now, if we look at Genesis 6, chapter 1, it starts off, and it came to pass. Now, this same word in Hebrew is used over here in Genesis 4 in verses 3 and also in verses 8. Now, verse 8 is where we really start the story of Cain killing Abel, and events progress kind of quickly to where Cain is made a vagabond and leaves and goes to the land of Nod. And it would seem while he was with Adam and Eve, before this happened, would have been whenever they must have had a daughter for him to marry as his sister, and since these were the only people that there were. And so Cain, in verse 17, when he knew his wife, he had already left for the land of Nod, and it would seem that his wife probably came with him, who was his sister, who Adam and Eve must have had. So it would make sense that before the events started happening with Cain and Abel, where he slew his brother, and things in a hurried way passed to where Cain left, it must have been prior to that whenever Cain married his sister. And so that would be verse 7 or prior. But it also makes sense that Adam and Eve probably would have had this daughter sometime maybe around verse 3. So thinking back to what we saw in the last section of looking at Genesis 1 and 2, what we saw was a brief summary of what was later expanded out to a longer chronology. So looking at this, what we have is, and it came to pass, is used at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, and we see the same word used twice over here in Genesis chapter 4, right in the time range of when it would make the most sense that Adam and Eve would have had a daughter that was Cain's sister and became his wife. And does that seem a coincidence? Well, I don't really think it seems a coincidence, because if we refer back to the last example, then what have we learned? What we saw was that Genesis 1:27 briefly summarized something that was given more detail in Genesis chapters 2:5 through 25. And what was summarized, that God made man in his image, and the image of God made he him, and the image of God made he, male and female made he them. And so we just had a few words there that summarized a longer section of the whole more complete story of God making Adam. Of the story of God making Eve was just summarized with male and female made he them. So we've already seen that a few words, a short phrase, that God can take that and in another place, expand it out into a more detailed chronology. So what are we looking at here? Genesis chapter 6 says, and it came to pass. Genesis chapter 4 twice says, and it came to pass. And it seems that it's no coincidence that this is when Cain probably would have married his sister. So it seems that what we're looking at here in Genesis 6:1, when it says it came to pass, is actually a marker that matches other markers found at the beginning of Genesis chapter 4, which give us a range. So what is Genesis chapter 6 actually starting off with? Well, it's starting off with a few words that summarize a longer date range that we see in chapter 4. So it came to pass corresponds in Genesis chapter 6 to it came to pass to this range that we see between Genesis chapter 4 verse 3 and about verse 7 to 8. So if we read, and it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them. Well, when did this originally start? Well, the first daughter was born here in this range, between verse 3 and verse 7 about, or 8, of Genesis chapter 4. I would say prior to verse 8. Now, the latest you could argue for this happening, that men began to multiply and that daughters were born unto them, would be over here in Genesis 4 verse 18, where it talks about how men were born several generations, and Lamech took unto him 2 wives. And so wherever we see begetting, we know that there were women involved. There were even 2 wives that Lamech took. So there seems to have been multiple women. Daughters had been born unto men who were multiplying. So when it says when men began to multiply, it lines up with about verses 17 through 19 here over in chapter 4, that we know it was taking place by this time. And we know the daughters had been born unto them. And so again, it seems that Genesis chapter 6 is summarizing a range of dates that we find in Genesis chapter 4. And it came to pass lines up with between verses 3 and 7 in chapter 4. And when men began to multiply and daughters were born unto them, describes the same events that we see in chapters 4:17 through 19. Now, when did this happen? Well, this is all the same section in chapter 4 going up through verse 26 in chronological order. And we see that, Seth was born, and then Enos was born, and then we see the same events repeated in chapter 5. Now, as Cain was born before Seth, it makes sense that Cain could have had 5 generations of descendants before Adam had Seth at 130 years of age. Cain was the first child born, and so it makes sense that by the time that Adam had Seth and that Seth had Enos, that it could have been that Cain had already had 5 generations of descendants. Now, if we add this all up, we're talking about 235 years. From Adam had Seth at 130, and then Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos, totaling 235. It would make sense that as Cain was born first, it would seem shortly after creation, that in 235 years, Cain could have had 5 generations of descendants by the time that Seth had Enos, totaling 235 years after creation. Oh, it definitely makes sense if we ask, well, when did men begin to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them? It was definitely before 235 years because of the overlap at the end of chapter 4 and chapter 5 that lets us know the dating on this. So it would actually make sense that the way this information has been laid out, it seems to indicate that the reason we see this overlap here is that we are being given dates. it makes the most sense that the 5 generations of Cain and the generation of Adam to Seth to Enos all is overlapped here because all of these events took place prior to 235 years after creation. While we aren't given specific dates for when Enoch was born and Irad and all the way up through Lamech, the text seems to indicate that all this happened prior to 235 years after creation. So even though we're not given exact dates on the genealogy of Cain, we are given a range that this all happened prior to 235. So, going back to Genesis 6, when it says, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply in the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them," we can know that all of this happened prior to year 235. Now, whether we look at "and it came to pass," and we're looking at Cain's wife, the big question mark is that Cain must have had a sister, that Adam and Eve had a daughter in chapter 4 prior to verse 17 in that time range, and this parallels, and it seems to be keywords and markers there. And then we look at when men began to multiply, and we definitely see men beginning to multiply with Cain's descendants, Cain, his wife, his sister, and his descendants in chapter 4 verses 17 through 19. And it makes the most sense that all of this happened prior to 235. So we're actually seeing at the beginning of chapter 6 is a few keyword phrases that point to longer, more detailed sections back here in chapter 4. The first verse in Genesis chapter 6 seems to refer back with keywords to date ranges we see in chapter 4 and events that are plainly stated to have taken place in chapter 4, just using a bit of contextual understanding as to when this happened. It says, "When men began to multiply." Well, this is when they began to multiply and had daughters, was all prior to 235.